You guys have been requesting more infographics here on the channel, and so today I deliver, right? You guys see the title. This plane ran out of fuel in the middle of the ocean. Apparently this is a true story. This is my first time hearing about it. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome. Let's go ahead and get into this video. Come on.
In the darkened air cabin, passengers wept and prayed. But the mighty turbines of the Airbus A330 were silent. The plane was out of fuel, with 75 miles of ocean between it and the land. August 23, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 departed from Toronto Pearson International Airport, YYZ, in Ontario, Canada at 11:52 p.m. UTC, bound for Humberto Delgado Airport, LIS, in Lisbon, Portugal. Piloting the Airbus A330 was 43-year-old Captain Robert Pichet. He's well experienced with 16,800 flight hours. His first officer, 28-year-old Dirk de Jager, had 4,800 hours of flight time. Between the two of them, they had over 1,100 hours of flight time on the Airbus 330. Captain Pichet was also an experienced glider pilot, a fact that would play a key role in solving the life-threatening situation that would soon occur. When leaving Toronto, the Airbus had 51.6 tons of fuel on board, 5 tons more than required by regulations, and 6 tons more than they needed for the flight. Powering the plane were twin Rolls-Royce Trent 772 B60 engines. This particular plane had just over 2 years of active service at the time of the flight. Not long after takeoff, air traffic directed the pilots of Flight 236 to adjust the flight path 60 degrees south to avoid congestion over the Atlantic Ocean. This minor deviation from the original flight plan would also play a crucial role in the survival of the flight. The takeoff and first few hours of the flight went smoothly. The night was calm with a clear sky. The passengers were a mix of tourists and expats looking forward to their early morning arrival in southern Europe. The wide-body Airbus had 362 seats and only 293 passengers, giving them space to spread out. Serving them was a cabin crew of 11. At 4:38 a.m. UTC, while they were high over the Atlantic, the fuel line servicing the right engine sprung a massive leak. About 30 minutes later, the pilots received their first sign that something was wrong, an alert warning of high oil pressure in the right engine and also low oil temperature. This was an uncommon problem, and the pilots couldn't think of a reason why it was happening. They assumed that the oil notification was a false alarm and there was something wrong with the sensors aboard the plane. They reported the situation to the Maintenance Control Center in Montreal. Maintenance Control advised them to continue to monitor the issue. At 5:36 a.m. UTC, the pilots received another alert. This time, the plane warned them of a fuel imbalance. The pilots still thought it might be a sensor issue, so they followed standard procedure to remedy the imbalance by transferring fuel from the left wing tank to the right one. Because of the leak, the pilots were actually dumping fuel through the fractured line. By this point, the leak had been occurring for about an hour and had only gotten worse. The aircraft was now losing fuel at a rate of about a gallon per second. The oil pressure continued to drop and the oil temperature continued to rise. At this point, pilots realized the warning wasn't a fluke. Something had gone terribly wrong. They called the lead steward to the cockpit and asked her to go look through one of the passenger windows to see if fuel was leaking out from under the right wing. However, the night was incredibly dark, and she couldn't see anything. At 5:45 a.m. UTC, the pilots decided to initiate a diversion to Lajes Air Base on Tessia Island in the Azores. 3 minutes later, they radioed a fuel emergency with Santa Maria Oceanic Air Traffic Control. This message alerted the ground crew that an airplane had less than the needed amount of fuel to finish the flight. The ground crew began to prepare for an emergency landing. Meanwhile, the majority of passengers were peacefully dozing or watching the movie Chocolat on the retractable television monitors above the aisles. Newlywed Margaret McKinnon went to use the tiny airplane restroom. When she tried to turn on the faucet, no water came out. She had no idea the bathroom's plumbing system depended on air pressure generated by the plane's engines. The non-functioning tap was also a symptom of the fuel leak. Margaret assumed the tap was just broken and returned to her seat next to John, her husband. Passengers began to stir as the movie ended. An episode of Seinfeld started playing and then suddenly cut off. The cabin lights flickered. An announcement was made over the loudspeaker in Portuguese. Margaret and John didn't understand, but passengers around them became alarmed. Some even broke into tears. Then the message was repeated in English. The pilot was experiencing difficulties and they should prepare for a water landing. The cabin crew directed the passengers to pull their life jackets from beneath their seats.
I'm not gonna hold y'all though, man. That they should have at least told the passengers something to keep them in the dark for that long, and then for them to find out on their own, basically last minute, literally last minute power going out. That's crazy.
Landing. The cabin crew directed the passengers to pull their life jackets from beneath their seats. They also told everyone to take off their shoes. This was in case the passengers had shoes with sharp heels that could damage the inflatable slide. The cabin crew spread out, repeating instructions in 3 languages, English, French, and Portuguese, making sure the passengers were properly securing their life jackets. One of the flight attendants broke down and began to cry. At 6:13 a.m. UTC, the right engine, engine number 2, on Air Transat Flight 236 flamed out due to lack of fuel.
What?
The plane was flying at 39,000 feet and was 170 miles from Lajes. Captain Pichet immediately began a descent to 33,000 feet, which was the proper single-engine altitude for the Airbus at the time. The plane could actually fly on one engine, and the pilots were going to do all they could to keep the plane in the sky. They also shut off the fuel transfer pump. Over the intercom, Captain Pichet announced the engine had gone out.
This kind of reminds me of what's that movie with Denzel? I think it was called Flight, where he had to like last minute maneuver and save the plane around on the plane. That's kind of what this reminds me of.
They also shut off the fuel transfer pump. Over the intercom, Captain Pichet announced the engine had gone out. Many passengers heard a loud click, as if part of the plane had shut down. The roar of the engine began to fade away. By now, the lights in the cabin went out. Over and over, the crew warned that when they said brace, the passengers should lean forward and put their hands behind their heads. 10 minutes after the right engine flamed out, the pilot sent a mayday to Santa Maria Oceanic Air Traffic Control. 3 minutes after the mayday call, at 6:26 a.m. UTC, the left engine also flamed out. The plane was now at 75 miles from Lajes. To make a terrible situation worse, without engine power, the plane's flaps, brakes, and spoilers lost hydraulic power. Thankfully, the ram air turbine properly deployed to provide essential power for critical sensors, flight instruments, as well as enough hydraulic pressure to operate the primary flight controls. Still, the plane was falling at a rate of 2,000 feet a minute. The pilots estimated they had about 15 minutes or so before they'd have to ditch in the ocean. Suddenly, the only thing those aboard Flight 236 heard was the eerie whistling of air against the fuselage. By now, many of the passengers were praying and weeping. Some pleaded in Portuguese, calling out the name of Our Lady Fatima. Others said goodbye to their families. The plane floated swiftly downward, much like a paper plane drifting in the wind. At 6:31 a.m. UTC, the oxygen masks dropped in the passenger cabin. The pilots grimly prepared for a water landing. Minutes later, one of the pilots yelled, "We have a runway! We have a runway!" They had sighted Lajes Air Base. Military air traffic controllers and radar vectors from Lajes ATC communicated with the pilots, guiding their approach to the island. Leaning into his experience as a glider pilot, Captain Pichet executed one 360-degree turn and then a series of S-turns to dissipate excess altitude during the engine-out glide. Passengers huddled in the darkness as the plane shuddered and jolted as it corkscrewed down.
People inside losing
Many
their
were
minds.
sick and vomited. It was beginning to grow light outside. The plane made a final turn.
I can imagine being inside of an airplane, right, and having them do these maneuvers in the air. So you're going down, but you're spinning in a circle. And you're a passenger on the inside, don't know what's going on. They're just telling you, you guys are going down. The stress is high.
Many were sick and vomited. It was beginning to grow light outside. The plane made a final turn, and the pilots aimed it at the runway. At 6:45 a.m. UTC, the plane's landing gear slammed down hard, around 1,030 feet past the threshold of the runway 33, at a speed of around 230 miles per hour. The aircraft bounced before touching down again, roughly 2,800 feet from the threshold. The passengers could hear the plane scraping and grinding as it slid against the tarmac. Maximum emergency braking was applied and retained. Finally, the plane came to a stop. With limited brakes, the 8 main tires had locked up, and the landing gear as well as the lower fuselage experienced massive damage from the impact. Some small fires started in the area of the left main gear wheels, but they were immediately extinguished by rescue response vehicles. The runway itself was also severely damaged, but Flight 236 had landed safely after gliding for nearly 75 miles without engines. It must have seemed like an eternity to the terrified passengers, but it was only about 18 minutes from the second engine failure to when they landed. When the plane finally came to a stop, the passengers began to cheer, but the crew rushed them toward the exits. Captain Pichet had ordered an emergency evacuation for fear that the aircraft would explode due to the damage it sustained during landing. Passengers slid down the emergency slides and ran for their lives into a field of dewy grass next to the runway. Buses soon arrived and took the shaken, bruised survivors to the small terminal. Ultimately, 14 passengers and 2 crew members experienced minor injuries from the rough landing. Another 2 passengers received serious injuries during the evacuation of the aircraft. The passengers waited several hours in a terminal before taking a boat to another airport, where they caught a second plane that took them to Lisbon early Saturday. The injured were treated at the local hospital on the island. Captain Pichet and First Officer de Jager were hailed as heroes. A few years later, the subsequent accident report both blamed and praised the pilots. Investigators listed pilot error as one of the leading causes of the accident because the air transit crew failed to identify the plane's fuel loss. They actually further fed the leak instead of isolating it. The high oil pressure, low oil temperature notification indirectly diagnosed the leak. Engine fuel is used to cool oil. Because of the leak, cold fuel was flowing through the fuel-oil heat exchanger much faster than normal, resulting in the oil cooling rapidly and increasing in viscosity, thereby raising the oil pressure. However, once the pilots thought the issue was with the sensors, they didn't consider anything else. As a result, they failed to follow standard operating procedures in possibly more than one instance. The case of Flight 236 in this example of confirmation bias is now studied in flight school. The accident report also praised the pilots, concluding that Captain Pichet's skill in gliding the aircraft to a successful landing averted a catastrophic accident and saved the lives of those on board. First Officer de Jager provided complete and effective support to the captain during the engine failure and subsequent glide to landing. The report also discussed the main cause of the accident, an incorrect part installed on the plane. 4 days before Flight 236, the Airbus underwent routine maintenance. In the oil filter on the right-hand engine, the mechanics found tiny metal chips. This was a sign that an engine component was about to fail. Unfortunately, the mechanics couldn't figure out what was causing the metal shedding, so they decided to swap the engine out and send it for separate maintenance. But they didn't have any spare engines available in North America, so they had a spare engine flown in from Hong Kong. When the maintenance crew started installing the loaner engine, they realized it was a similar but not perfect fit. After some research, they found a technical service bulletin issued by Rolls-Royce. The company had made a slight modification to the engine to improve hydraulic pump efficiency. The plane had been using engines from after Rolls-Royce change, but the loaner engine was from before the changes. This meant that in addition to swapping the engine, the maintenance crew should have changed the hydraulic pumps, the hydraulic lines, and fuel line to match the engine they were installing on the plane. The service bulletin explained how to do this maintenance work and exactly what components should be changed. However, due to a computer failure in the maintenance control unit, they couldn't access the information. Rolls-Royce was called for advice. Ultimately, the setup was checked by the maintenance engineers and it was decided that there was enough clearance between the fuel and the hydraulic lines. However, they didn't take into account that when they were installing the engine setup, there was no pressure in the lines. As hydraulic pressure was applied to the hydraulic line, the line stiffened and the tiny clearance between the hydraulic line and the fuel line was lost. Per servicing rules, the engine was put through a ground run and passed. The aircraft looked fine, but after 4 hours of flight, where the right engine fuel and hydraulic lines chafed each other, the fuel line ruptured and sprang a big leak. The report estimated that Flight 236 lost about 12 to 15 tons of fuel per hour. Meanwhile, the engine continued to work fine as there was nothing wrong with the engine itself. The report on AirSat Flight 236 triggered an in-depth review of the part, the removal and installation instructions, as well as the testing procedures in the authorized technical manual. Several countries also began requiring new airplane flight manuals to include procedures in the event of a fuel leak. The Airbus 330 was repaired and returned to service in December 2001 with the nickname Azores Glider. It was in service with Air Transat until March 2020 when it was put in storage due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On October 18, 2021, the aircraft operated its last flight with Air Transat and was subsequently returned to the owner AirCap. Its future use is unknown.
Tell you what, man, being a pilot, very high paying job. But good Lord, you overlook one thing. If you don't think of the right thing in the right moment, it can cost you your job. Luckily, the pilot here maneuvered the plane, saved the people, saved the plane for the most part. He was blamed for the outcome here, partially, but you know what I mean, it is what it is. So comment down below what infotainment you guys want me to check out next. And until next time, y'all be safe out there. Peace.